Well, thank you, and I wanted to just start by thanking the Turkish Cultural Foundation and also Dr. Sumio for helping me with this, and also especially to you for making it out on a Friday afternoon to the outer walls of the Kapalı Çarşı. I've had a really, this is actually a very difficult topic, and you kind of alluded to it, because this part of the world hasn't really ever been without its issues. And, you know, my friends said, oh, don't worry, you've been doing this stuff for 30 years, it'll be easy, it'll be easy. And in fact, it's not. I mean, I think no matter what little piece you try and look at, whichever stone you turn over, there's something else under it, and it often leads to asking a lot of questions, and also, you know, sometimes something seems like something on the surface, but that's not really quite what it is, and sometimes actually finding out what it is really difficult, and maybe we'll never really know. That's the other thing. Let's see. Okay, well, this is just, I find this a very funny, amusing picture, actually. It's from a 45 from Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, I will say, from the early 1970s. And even the kind of Turkish, there's a little clue in there, but do we really usually say that in Turkish anymore? Orkestranın refakati. Orkestrasının. Yes. Maybe on the radio. Anyway, and look at that. I mean, you got a fezzes and a pasha type hat, and yeah, we'll get back to that. So, who am I? Why should we be here? I am Canadian. I do not have any Middle Eastern or Eastern European heritage in my background that I know of. I became enamored of this music 30 years ago, and I became fascinated, and I pursued it, and I wanted to learn more about it. And I started in my native city of Toronto. I found some people. I found a Turkish folklore group. I began working with them. I found a Macedonian folklore group. I then began working with them. And these things, with the different kind of contacts and whatnot, again, it made things less, at first I thought it was very clear, and yet the more that I got into it, the less clear it became. And this picture is actually 14 or 15 years old, and I'm going to talk about it for just a sec, because to me it's like Orientalism. Mm-hmm. And I needed a press shot right away. I was actually performing with a group, but I couldn't get the group together all at once. So it was kind of like, how do you represent a group with just one person? And in a way, it's such a Balkan mishmash. My shoes are Serbian. The oud is actually a Syrian oud. There is a nargile in the back that's from Egypt. The fiddle came out of somebody's attic. The darbuka was actually made by a Portuguese instrument maker in Toronto. The pants that I'm wearing, I made based on an old shalvar pattern from fabric that I bought on Istiklal Caddesi, when you could still buy fabric on Istiklal Caddesi. And the scarf was, actually that was one of the ladies from Düzce. That was one of the earthquake lady scarves. The drum that I'm holding, and that's why I'm going to talk about this, the drum that I'm holding is Albanian, or rather I got it at the Ženski Pazar, the ladies' Pazar in Skopje a few years before this picture was taken. And the fellow who sold it to me was the most, he was just a really wonderful character. And he was like, you know, what are you, a Canadian, doing in this part of the world, speaking Turkish? It was Macedonia wasn't fully its own thing yet. It was shortly after the war in Serbia and Bosnia. And the streets of Skopje were full of NATO guys and tanks and stuff. So, I mean, you know, and here's this Canadian walking around the market speaking Turkish, and they're like, But he was a very sweet guy, and he started talking to me, and he was really enthusiastic. And he said, oh, well, you know, would you like a cup of coffee? And I said, sure, I'll have a cup of coffee. Turkish coffee, of course, Tursko. And you know, so we continued to chit-chat and this coffee never came, and it never came. And, you know, 10 minutes went by, 15 minutes went by, at least 20 minutes went by, and finally I was like, well, the conversation's kind of winding down here. And I said, I guess they forgot the coffee. He said, oh, no, they certainly haven't forgot the coffee. And sure enough, like a couple of moments later, two people came. One was carrying the old style tray on a hook like that. It was covered with a very beautiful cloth. There was a little bottle, a little surahi, a little jug of water, and a glass, and the jezve, and the cup, and a piece of lokum. The jezve, the outside of the jezve was black, because I think they roasted the beans, ground the beans, and made the coffee. It was the most delicious cup of Turkish coffee. That to me is my gold standard for a cup of coffee, and I had it in the market in Skopje. And in a way, that's kind of a little allegory of what you can find. But the coffee also has this other side to it, which I think is interesting. Because, like I mentioned before, I was in Toronto, and or come from Toronto, and used to go to the Greek restaurants, you know, because it was a fun ethnic thing to do, and you could get yummy food, and there'd be dancing, and you always had to order Greek coffee. And one time I went to a Macedonian event, and, you know, I was going to have the coffee, and she said, oh, would you like a Macedonian coffee? And I went, oh, for heaven's sake, yes, sure, I'll have the Macedonian coffee. And I thought about it, and it's because the relationship between the Greeks and the Macedonians isn't great. And in fact, in Toronto, sometimes in the diaspora, it's worse, you know, sometimes. But the funny thing is that when I went to Macedonia and Bulgaria, they were quite happy to call it Tursko. You know, they don't have a problem with it. So so just how we name things. And sometimes I think, why don't we just call it jezve coffee? You know, we call it filter or espresso. Let's like not worry about who did what with it. Everybody's adopted it. We all love it. Let's just call it by how we make it. Anyway, that's a long and winding road. I think I have to try and tell the Hoxha story. The Hoxha stories are also found various parts throughout the Balkans as well. And there's another character, like the coffee, who many people have adopted, and his roots are as obscure as anything we can get. But one time the Shah's three wise men, or Kadas or whatever, heard the Hoxha speaking, and they didn't like what he was saying, so they accused him of heresy. So he was brought to the Sarai, and, you know, he was going to be tried by these three. And the Hoxha asked, in his defense, he said, I need to ask these guys a question. He said, I need to find my notes because I know I'm here, I forgot this. I need to ask, you know, let me ask these guys a question. Can you tell me what bread is? And the first judge, yes, wise man says, bread is a sustenance, it's a food. And the guy goes, okay, and the second guy says, well, bread is a combination of flour and water that, you know, you subject it to fire and it changes form. Okay, and then he asks the third guy, and what do you think bread is? Well, bread is a gift from God. And so the Hoxha turns to the Shah and says, look, if these three guys can't agree unanimously on something as simple as bread, how can they possibly judge me for being a heretic? That's much more complicated. And sometimes I think that when we look at things like this, you know, we simplify, or we try and simplify, and actually it's much more complicated, and sometimes we really have to withhold our judgment. Here is what we're talking about, and if I think most people in the room know this, but I just threw this up just in case to refresh us. This is what we're talking about these days, usually. This is the Balkan Peninsula in gold color, mostly. And you can see, in case you haven't traveled there, you'll notice there's lots of mountains. In fact, this has had a lot to do with the history there. It's created regions, these create natural geographic boundaries that, you know. All right. Very quickly, keeping the history to a minimum, this is Ottoman Empire, more or less, in its late. And you can see that late Ottoman period is pretty well, you know, more or less, this part anyway that we're interested in is still kind of the Balkans. It's going to start in about 20 or 30 years from the time that this map was sketched out. It's going to start shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. That's what you alluded to. And that has, of course, has a profound effect on the culture and history, particularly on the culture. I mean, masses of migration, masses, waves of migration. And with that, various cultural things shift places. And sometimes I think it's a very, on one hand, I like to think that a culture is of a place, but then when a place has been displaced and replaced and reshuffled, sometimes trying to get that picture again becomes difficult and challenging. So, yes, the blanket, or in this case, the weaving. If you think, I mean, that region, the Balkan region there, has been under many empires at different times, you know, ancient Greeks, Rome, Byzantium, whatever, and various Macedonia. I mean, you know, different kingdoms arose and fall throughout there. But the one that we're kind of interested right now is the Balkan administration, or not Balkan, the Ottoman administration that came in. And I usually like to try and think of it as kind of a blanket. And I like this analogy because it did move in over the top in a kind of a way. It was this sort of overriding, it wasn't purely unified, but it definitely blanketed the area. But when we think about a blanket or a piece of woven textile, it's got these fibers that run in and out and cross over each other. And what happens over time, and in some parts, particularly in the Balkans, that layer was there so long that things really did start to weave together. And they would feed from the bottom up into it and out, and from the top down and into it and out. And over time, another reason why I love this particular blanket that I found on the internet, I like how it's got these different flowers that emerged. And in a way, that's kind of what happens over time. In you know, things move in, things grow up, things come down, and all the different cultures and religions and languages that were in this peninsula, because it certainly wasn't a blank slate when the Ottomans moved in there. It was extremely rich and vibrant and colorful. They all kind of start to mix and feed together. And so you get, I like how you kind of get the flowers. I'm also very delighted by the tree of life image there. Because sometimes it's good to think about, sometimes we only see the flowers and we forget that there's a lot of different roots and a lot of things feed the roots to get to the top. The other reason why I like the blanket analogy is that sometimes we start to pull things out and you start to say, well, that's my thread. I want that. And so, just like the coffee, no, it's Greek coffee, no, it's Turkish coffee, no, it's Macedonian coffee. And what happens is that it ruins the integrity of the whole, in fact. Like sometimes, yes, we want to identify the little different pieces, but we can't really hold on to them. They do kind of belong together. They belong as somehow an intact whole. It can be very difficult to sometimes see the whole without, you know, without taking it apart into little pieces and appreciate it as its whole. So that's why it's what I call the blanket analogy. So every once in a while I'll refer to it, it's the blanket. What do we have here? Oh yes, in a rainbow. Aren't they beautiful? Like, they're just these amazing things. This is the other thing, that it happens particularly with music. It happens to a degree also with language and many, many, many things. But when does one thing become another? Sometimes it's not clear. And when we look at a rainbow, and you look at, in this particular rainbow, for me anyway, the red, orange, yellow section, you know, when does that orange really become orange? When does it turn from red to orange? When does it turn from orange to yellow? And in fact, that if you see clear bands in a rainbow, we are imposing this. This is our brain imposing the sense of color on it. The actual, it's a complete continuum. It's just the way that we see it. And culture can be that way too, particularly musical culture, particularly things that have had a chance to pro together or interact for a long time. Sometimes we make the imposition that they're different, or we're seeing that, whereas they're really, it's, you know, we may want to say that's red and that's yellow, but really it's mostly orange. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about that for now. Particularly with the performing arts. So with music and with dance, to a certain degree with theater, we're really at the mercy of memory and what is transmitted. And until there are ways of capturing sound and movement, we can really often only really guess what things might have sounded like or moved like in the past. So I think there's a very interesting thing that if you study languages, and I'm sure many people here do, but they talk about you could travel from southern Italy to the top of Italy, and if you traveled from village to village and sort of learned each dialect as you went up through Italy, you would go from speaking, you know, southern Sicilian to speaking something that approximated German by the time you got to the top. Culture, music does that too. I mean, that's just what happens, you know. Every once in a while, yes, there will be a sharp division, maybe because of a geographical feature, but by and large, things shift and change. So, way back 30 years ago, I began listening to all these different kinds of music from the Balkans, and I really was fascinated. So this is a singer. It's one of the first, when I first got interested in this music, this was one of the first singers I really fell in love with. And at that time, I'm still trying to figure out what was going on, but at that time I hadn't quite figured out what was going on. We're just going to listen to a little bit of it. But I don't know, can you see that? It's kind of murky. This is from the late 60s, early 1970s, radio television Macedonia. They're recreating a scene back from, you know, turn of the century, I guess. Look at the dresses, the tones going by in the background, the instrumentation. They're outdoors, they're enjoying their time outdoors. People are strolling. This is music for entertainment. This is music for, they're on the water, possibly by the shores of Lake Ohrid, which was a very popular kind of summery holiday destination. A very refined, lovely kind of music. Urban. Okay? Does this melody sound familiar to anyone here? Okay, I'll see if I can remind you a little later. So what this was, or you know, I found it, this was a tradition that was referred to as chalgia in Macedonia. Chalgia, chalgia. And it's old city songs, sung in Macedonian, usually. And of course, you know, does it not sound like Turkish music though? Even if the words seemed a little bit, I mean, it's in Macedonian, so I'm not expecting everybody, but the feeling, I mean, it had a very Turkish feeling. And of course, the instrumentation. And so this is a type of ince saz music. And this is almost unquestionably a legacy of that interaction between that Ottoman blanket and urban Balkan culture. So this is not purely Turkish, obviously, but it's not purely Balkan either. It's one of these beautiful flowers that emerged. And let's see what the next little bit is. I think I got some more stuff here. Yes. They were very popular on the radio, and it kind of went out of fashion for a while. I'll play these guys for a second. Get a little taste of that? I'll put them down. Komşi. There's a lot of Turkish, not a lot, but there are a number of Turkish words, even in daily Macedonian, and again, there's no surprise about that happening. Again, I mean, here we have late 60s, early 1970s, we've got guys dressed in fezzes. And playing very, a not unusual type of, well, Ottoman or even classical. Turkish light classical, urban, again. These people playing were mixed heritage, in that I will say that this is not from my research, but from research done by other people, particularly that of Sonia Tamar-Seaman. And if you're interested in this part of the world, she is definitely a musicologist to look up and read about, because she's a very thorough researcher. But a lot of these, some of these guys would have been wrong. Pardon me? Sonia Tamar-Seaman. I'll write it up. Mixed, so some of them would be, you know, Macedonian, some of them would be actually Turkish background, some of them were wrong, some were a little bit of everything. But that was the kind of the culture. And I think by the 60s, this was kind of becoming something that the old people listened to. It wasn't really, 60s and into the 1970s, this wasn't something that, you know, really appealed to young people all that much anymore. There's been a revival of it, but the revival has become much more Slavic than it used to be, I will say. Oh yeah, here's another picture of them a little later. It's kind of bad. It's a screenshot, but it would, you know, they would play on TV. Same kind of combination of instruments and singing and playing. Anything about that sound remind you of anything else? No? Large groups of people singing together. Chorus. All right, let's see if these guys do it. More modern, but instead of we have the Jumbush instead of So what language is that? It's Turkish. I mean, if you couldn't understand it, I should have written out the words. Raki kalmasın Tahir Aga meyhanesinde. He's drinking, Tahir Aga goes to the meyhane and he drinks everything and he stumbles home. This is the only Turkish song on the recording, so this ensemble usually performs in Macedonian. But every once in a while they'll throw in a Turkish language song, and this is slightly later. This is from the 80s. You can see they've modernized a little bit. They don't feel they need to wear fezzes anymore. Accordion is, you know, a more popular, a more modern idea of an instrument has come in. So it's introduced ideas of harmony. Actually, the harmony was there for a long time, but it's kind of this. And I think what's interesting to me is that they were still willing and knew Turkish to to throw in every once in a while, because they knew, even though it's a dialect of Turkish that may be a little unfamiliar to some, they know that their audience is going to have a few Turkish speakers in it and is going to appreciate the reference to it. This kind of ensemble, I believe, is still, again, going to the summer places and playing around outdoors. It's very much, and what do you have when you're sitting around outdoors? You're having a drink. A lot of the songs, not all of them, but quite a few of them reference drinking or entertainment culture to some degree. There's an awful lot of songs about love and romance and that sort of thing, but there's a category of songs that talk about drinking. So I was just going to say the meyhane. There's still people just getting together and singing for the sheer joy of it. There's still a little bit of that left. And that was something that struck me when I first came to Istanbul, was how you could go to a meyhane and people would just burst into song, and they would, they didn't, after a couple of shots of rakı, they didn't really care how perfectly they sang. They were just, wow, And I was also quite surprised that if you tried to do that in North America, the best you could do would be maybe a couple of Beatles songs or some television commercials, but that the collective knowledge of light classical music, at least 20, 30 years ago, I was always really kind of surprised from it. And I think, I know that meyhane culture is quite old in Istanbul, Galata and all that, but there is a little kind of there is a thread, let me say, with that, and this is so. But I guess it's just to underscore that this is music for relaxation, for entertainment, for kind of the refined in a way. It's let's see, where am I going to go next? So let's listen to this a little bit. Anybody recognize who that is? Yeah. Yes. If you're not familiar with her, she was one of the great singers of Turkish light and classical music. Fade her down a little bit. This is one of several very, very, very well-known songs in Turkey. Daylar, bir on daylar. The song that I played at the very beginning, the Ay Goruşitse Tsırno Oko, they're cousin songs. Ay Goruşitse Tsırno Oko, daylar daylar viran daylar. Now they differ slightly in form in a couple of places. One's telling one story. They tell completely different stories. One's telling one story, one's telling another story. They are definitely cousins. There's some good reasons to think that the Turkish came first, but that's the kind of weaving together. That's the kind of fruit that I'm talking about. That sometimes is, do you really want to pull it apart, or just want to enjoy it for its beauty? I'm going to skip to a little farther in the track here because, let's see. This is another song. And I'll tell you what that is. That's another famous song called Ali Shimin, known these days anyways, Ali Shimin Kaşları Kare. And very typical, so this is Safiye Ale. It was, this might have been from a radio performance, actually. I have to look at the notes where that recording came from. It's very typical to connect these songs together in a kind of little suite form, so they flow into one another. And it's from a body of songs that are called Rumeli türküleri. Okay, and Rumeli, if you remember, is that in the later Ottoman period is basically what we refer to as the Balkans today. Or when I'm trying to explain this to North Americans, what is Rumeli? And I sort of go, well, it's kind of former Ottoman territories in Europe, depending on who you talk to. Because that, you know, grew and shrank at different times. Safia Ayla was a very popular singer. Apparently she was one of Ataturk's favorite singers. And apparently Ataturk was very fond of these Rumeli türküleri. And actually the first time that I was aware of hearing one of these songs was shortly after I arrived in Turkey in 1985. I turned on my radio one November morning, tuning into the folk music show because I had my little schedule and I knew what time the folk music program was going to be on the radio. And I heard this kind of stuff. It was like, well, that's classical music. That's not folk music. Folk music's got Balama. You know, and so that was kind of, and so it's very, it was November the 10th, so do I need to say why? That would be a significant day. It's commemorating Ataturk's passing, and so these songs have kind of become, some of them anyway, have become fairly strongly attached to him. But that's kind of beside, that's partly why I was saying that you can't get into this stuff with art without turning over stones and finding out, you know, lifting it up and seeing all this other stuff underneath. That's a whole big, huge discussion about how music can have whole other, seemingly innocent, you know, thing can start to have all kinds of other associations attached to it. And that can be manipulated. And I'm fond of saying there's no such thing as an innocent folk song, and it has to do with how people can take something like music, which people, we as humans, have a very strong emotional connection to music, and that can be manipulated. That can be manipulated. So it's just something to look out for sometimes when you're looking at things. Has this been played with on a level beyond its music? And often, very often, you'll find that it has. Okay, well, I started to wonder about these Rumeli things, and I was thinking, well, you know, I've got all these recordings from Yugoslavia. How, you know, and then I started to see the connection between that Çalgıya, sound-wise, and this Rumeli, sound-wise, and started to even find, like I said, songs that were really close cousins, if not, you know, versions of one another. And I started to think, well, it had to have been somewhere. I mean, you know, it just didn't emerge here. There must be some older examples of it. I mean, what did it sound like at the turn of the century? Safia Ayla, a great singer, a wonderful interpreter, but she came from a classical tradition. And if this is folk music, shouldn't there be a folk tradition about this? Like, shouldn't this, you know, exist somewhere else? And just a sort of going around and looking and trying to find things out, one day I stumbled across this lady. Kadriye Latifova was a singer from Bulgaria. Her career, she was most active in the 1950s. She died early in the 1960s. And I heard this. Let's see, let me get it here. tell you how excited I was. I thought, oh my gosh, I found it. You know, this is how it used to be. You know, this is you know, because you're all, I don't know, you're always trying to say how far back can I go? You know, where can I look for more inspiration? And it is actually a really lovely rendition. She made a number of recordings, and you know, it's an oud. She's from Bulgaria. This was a recording that was probably originally made for the Bulgarian radio before they started eliminating Turkicism and getting people to change their names. Was actually quite tolerant. Well, this is what I was talking about. Sometimes, you know, things leading us onto, you know, we can quickly jump to conclusions, and we start asking a couple of more questions or looking at for some more things. We find it doesn't quite add up to what we think we saw. Although I just have to say an aside for my textile friends, notice the way that she ties the scarf in her hair. Okay. I looked at the rest. I found a lot more recordings by her, as well as I'd been collecting recordings from Turkish singers from Bulgaria for a number of years, but it took me a while to find her. And I started to assemble this list of all these songs that she covered, and I realized, oh, wait a minute, that song's from Erzurum. Oh, wait a minute, that song's a popular Turkish nightclub song written by Saadettin Kaynak. And then I started to go, and that's not to say, and this is one of my you know, that her interpretation wasn't authentic. It is extremely authentic. You know, she gives certain kinds of color. She makes choices about phrasing that if you compare her with a singer from Turkey of the same period, she's adding her own personal feeling and her own regional feeling to that. So it's very, very authentic. But it made me wonder, did she really learn it from her grandfathers, which is what I hoped, or did she learn it from somewhere else? And I think the good, it might have been a bit of both. I don't think we can know. Unfortunately, she has, you know, passed on, so we can't ask her. There she is with her band. Again, this is in a theater, which I think is also important to notice, because there were Bulgarian, there were theater troupes at the time which would do shows not necessarily Bulgarian. So there would be a Turkish review show that would travel through the areas, and they needed music. And where were they getting it? Well, they were listening to records. I don't know how people's Bulgarian is. But I will tell you that this bit here says Safiye Hanım. This is from a friend of mine who's an avid collector. He spends part of the year in Bulgaria, an American friend of mine named Larry Weiner, and he buys lots of, he's more interested in the Bulgarian stuff, but he buys lots of records, and you know, when you buy a lot, you know, there's always a few random things in there, so he often sends me the Turkish ones and says, Brenna, can you figure this one out? I did a little bit of sleuthing about this title, and it may have never been released in Turkey. And what would happen, the record label is called Radio Prom, and I don't, you know, I'm kind of wondering here, but artists would come to the Turkish radio and they would sing, and you know, there would often be a recording made of it, and then they would just sit there in the archives, and I wonder if sometimes a few little chunks didn't march out and make their way out to these different communities where people were hungry for this. And this was probably not done with a proper license to any Turkish or other foreign label that might have had the rights to the recording. Mm-hmm. So this was just sort of a way to supply a population with recordings. But this is why stuff, really interesting stuff, turns up in places where you don't really expect it. So when I looked at Kadriya's repertoire, I realized, yeah, she was probably getting a lot of this material from Turkey. She was getting a lot of it from Turkey. And actually that's another clue. The radio. People listen to the radio. They, just like me, they were coming home and, you know, tuning in to get the latest, to hear the latest. So sometimes imagining that, you know, you found that isolated thing that was just that plant that was just blooming in the corner of the garden there waiting for you. That's actually, no, its roots have been continually being fed over time by sometimes by sources that you weren't quite expecting. So the gramophone in general, like recording technology, which really started to kick in at the turn of from the late into the 20th century. What are we now? 19th, 20th century, whatever, you know, back then. I always get my numbers mixed up. This is a beautiful example of a gramophone, I believe from Istanbul, and I believe it's from a collection here. But this shows you they were just, you know, really important things. And that these had the recording industry had a profound profound effect on music on all kinds of levels. It allowed people to, who were living in slightly more remote areas, to get their ears on things. It allowed people, things would travel very far. We now have a lot of diaspora. They were huge consumers of recorded media. This is an old catalog from the collection of Cemal Ünlü. He's written an excellent book in Turkish on this subject, if you're interested in the history of gramophones and recording. I have to show this very quickly and talk about this. So we have this song, Alışımın Kaşları Kare. This is a kind of a missing link, and this is what we need to find more of. This is from I know it's not very clear, it is from an as yet unpublished thesis, so that's okay. These are, and this is kind of one of the missing links that I was kind of looking for. So what I was saying, like, how did this song get here? Why was it so popular? Still don't know that, but this is notation from a man named Kemal, oh my God. Altınkaya, thank you. I was going to say Altıntaş. Altınkaya. And this is a really rare and wonderful thing. And he was a very avid collector of these folk songs, quite knowledgeable about music, and a very detailed collector as well. And this is one thing that I love about this. Every version I've heard, and I've listened to a lot of versions of Alışımın Kaşları Kare, I can tell you, I've only ever heard 2 verses. This has a 3rd verse. So that's something that's really interesting to me. He makes a note about, this song is from north of the Danube, in fact, but the version that he collected is how it's commonly sung in Üsküp, or was commonly sung in Üsküp at the time that he collected it. And he makes the point of saying, and these days they're not singing it right. He said it should be alush, not alish. The dialect is alush, not alish. So this is the kind of thing, and when this whole manuscript and new paper comes out, I'm sure we're going to discover a lot more exciting, wonderful, wonderful things. But this is the kind of thing that when you're dealing with music, especially, it's very difficult, and folk music even more so, because while the classical music was recorded, and while there was a pretty effective and standardized way of teaching, folk music just sort of happens on the fly, and documenting it rarely happens. People, 150 years ago weren't as literate as they are now. People weren't writing things. We don't have the diary of the meyhaneci from Üsküp to look at, who's like recording, which musicians came and what they sang that day. We don't have those kinds of little tidbits. What we can piece together are what foreign travelers sometimes wrote, or just travelers in general wrote, who may or may not be able to articulate what they're hearing. People have described music from this part of the world as the squealing of cats. I don't agree. But so this finding little pieces like this are so important in trying to understand the picture, and kind of gives us an idea of how widespread some of those songs were. And so, yeah, that's just a little hint. Yes, we're going to hear another little piece of music. We're going to skip over to Bulgaria. Sorry. Language, Bulgarian. Instrument, kanun. Yeah, not something that we usually associate with Bulgarian music these days. This is from a collection of a friend of mine named Lauren Brody. She has a wonderful 4 CD collection of early recordings from Bulgaria, full of wonderful treats, I have to say. This is a gramophone cover from her collection. Again, you can see how, I'm still trying to figure this one out. I love the rabbits. It's like gramophone, so easy. Even rabbits can operate it. The city's in the background. You can take the music anywhere. You can go out for a party and bring the music with you. But there's something about that melody, and again, I don't know how many people are familiar with this. Basically the same melody as we just heard in Bulgarian. And, I managed to hit it into the solo. This is Okay Temiz. The song is called Ramizan in Turkish. So that's what we heard in Bulgarian just a moment before. So these songs are, they're very closely related. They're cousins. They're cousins. All right. Going from Ramizan, okay, how about this song? Is this song familiar to people? Oh. Yes. Yeah. Vardar is, of course, the river that runs through the heart of modern Macedonia. And then here we go. We recognize this. So they're singing Maya Dadan Kalkan Kalklar. And then we have so I don't know if you could hear that. So that's an interesting puzzle. So the first one we heard was a Turkish radio and television chorus, and they sing Maya Dadan Kalkan Kalklar. The second recording is identified as the Macedonian Radio and Television Gençlik Korusu, and they sing Şardan'dan Kalkan Kalklar. I've been trying to figure out where Maya Da is, actually, and the only place that I can see it is somewhere near Kırklareli, unless there's a small peak in this particular range, which is the Şar Planina, the Şar Mountains. And it actually makes much more sense for it to be the Şar Mountains. This is an extremely, it's beautiful. A couple of people said, I want to go there now. It's in the very north, forms the very northern border of present-day Macedonia, Kosovo, Serbia, and it's a very steep range. So that's why it forms a natural border. And there's a lot of interesting music that comes from around there. Now, because of time, oops. But I want to just play a couple of tastes of a couple of other things here. So what is in this mountain range is there are some very interesting groups of people. There is a group of Slavic-speaking, basically Macedonian or South Serbian, depending on how you want to define the dialect, Muslims who've been there for quite some time. The music that they do is incredibly interesting. And their costumes are very interesting, and it's kind of, you really wonder, I've talked to a lot of dancer friends of mine who also go, going on there. It's a very, very, very interesting kind of little pocket to look at. And you know, the fact that they became Muslim but didn't feel it necessary to adopt Turkish as a language is quite interesting. One of the big bands of influence, we don't have enough time. Yeah, well, let's talk about one of the other guys here. Let's talk about. I love this stuff, by the way. I know actually some people hate that, so it's true. That is, okay, first of all, quick, does it kind of bring anything to mind for you? I'm just out of curiosity.
A little bit like Mehter.
A little bit like Mehter, yes, not bad.
But more Albanian.
Maybe, yes. Well, there's a reason for that, though, too. What about, has anybody been to Kırkpınar? But yes, this type, they're called zurla there, not zurna, those instruments. They are, of course, related to what is known in Turkish today as zurna. The big question is, in the Balkans, one of the questions is, were they brought there by Roman musicians, or were they introduced by the Mehter, who, when you think about it, were often the first things that people encountered, for good or for bad. You had the incredible sound of the military marching band to herald your arrival and scare people. Hopefully into surrender, actually. But they would stick around. I mean, look at that geography. They didn't just sort of fly in and fly out. Once you were on a campaign, you were there for a long time. And so the way that music is actually, what we heard is a dance piece. It's called Osman Pasha, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, it's called Osman Pasha. And there's a lot of zurna and zurlas, especially in the Balkans, is still very, very popular for wedding processions, for leading, for dancing. So you kind of wonder exactly at what point. I mean, and we're talking about it was there for 500 years in many places. So what bubbled up? What switched? What changed? What got adopted and articulated into what we hear, or we can hear now if we're interested in finding zurla. These fellas are, I'm pretty sure, Roman. It's definitely been one of the, it's not to say that you won't find non-Roma players of zurla, but definitely tends to be a tradition. So, yeah, so that's a whole other area of influence to look at, is the Mehterhan. And I think one of the, a lot has been written about how Western classical musicians were very impressed by the sounds of these ensembles. These were a professional elite. They were well trained. Early in the days, complicated music was written for them. They weren't just playing boomba, 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 boomba. There was some really courtly music. It was an honor to be, especially if you were in the sarai level of this. And when we look at what the repertoire that's left, there are a lot of songs that are also in this Rumeli Türkü repertoire that are also kind of in the Mehter. And it does make sense because as the empire sat there, who was going into the Janissaries? They were taking kids from the Balkans and sending them. So this cross-fertilization was going on for an awfully long time. And that's another thing that it's very hard to separate that one out. You know, whatever you think about scary military invasions, there's a very, very interesting cultural byproduct of that's happened. So quickly, other traces. So there is another way that a lot of, so we had our sort of urban kind of elite music. We had something that might have, you know, certainly has traces to military and military music. Let's have a listen to these guys and see what this reminds me of. So one thing that personally I love about Albanian and also Macedonian music is the interesting rhythmic phrases that happen. That's like my little musical brain getting all excited about them. Their instruments, they call them çitelli, so çift telli, and şarkiye. So çift telli, çifte telli, a two-string, and şarkiye, shark, Eastern. Clearly these instruments are related to Turkish instruments and what is usually referred to as a bağlama or saz in Turkey today. That's not to say that there weren't long-necked tambours in the region before, because I think when I mentioned this wasn't exactly a blank slate that walked in there, and you know, sometimes the reason why people love something and adopt it is because it's kind of close to what they know already. So, but what else is interesting? Well, these are Muslim Albanians, and another big way for music and culture to move through here is with dervishes, with religion. So usually, Bektashis and various forms of Sufism are much easier to, at least in the beginning, for people to accept. They're generally more tolerant of different kinds of things, and people sing and continue to. They just kind of work. Let's put it that way. I'm not going to go into a big discussion about that. Way not enough time. What's the next one? Yeah, this is the one I'm going to end with. I'm going to play a little bit of this song. So the music, I'll just leave it running in the background for a second. The music is from a cassette that I got in the 1980s from Bosnia called Saz. And then, you know, all the wars happened, and I actually know that you know, many cultures have been wiped out. You know, villages have been wiped out, and with them, knowledge and culture, especially if it's not the sort of culture that gets written down, like folk music. If you lose the people, you lose the music. I was really, really, really thrilled to see this photo. It was taken in 1912 by a friend of a friend named Peter Littman near Tuzla in Bosnia. He is, from the description that Peter wrote, it sounds like the man here was singing more or less in this style here. So I was actually kind of thrilled to know that this is still around. And what this is old sevdalinka. Not the kind that you tend to find in the cities today that's got accordions and bass and has had certain kinds of Western harmonization imposed on it. This is a more villagey kind of old style. And this photo, this is the other reason why I wanted to bring this up. This photo was taken in a village where they were doing their annual brandy distillation. So part of it is to play music, eat, and test this year's product. And I kind of wanted to also end on an eating and drinking note because we are here, and I guess if there's some people who want to stay for the buffet afterwards, we have that. And I'm sure I've like confused the heck out of some people, but does anybody have any questions or criticisms? Or I will make a list of the music that I play, and also some of the people, the researchers that I mentioned. There are more of them, in fact, so I'll try and do that and make that available, because if this is an area of interest to you, whether for music or for other reasons, there's really a lot of interesting scholarship that's coming up, and a lot more as people are learning how to understand Ottoman archives even, and the kind of information that you can tease out of those as well. So, yeah.